Yeah, so Devil Jam. This one released on November 3rd and has a little bit of buzz behind it, so I thought I'd check it out. I was looking for games to review coming out at the start of the week, and Devil Jam really caught my eye. I love a good survivor game, having put tons of hours into Vampire Survivors and Potato, along with a couple other fun ones. This game looked to be all in on some really killer rock music and some interesting looking characters. The trailer really did make it seem to be that beautiful blend of survivor gameplay and the social aspects of Hades. However, Devil Jam hasn't got much under a surface that barely counts as a pond, and while playing it is passable, sometimes even fun, I didn't find any reason to flock to this when there are so many other good survivor games on the market. Let's start with the real meat of the game, the actual ones. At its roots, is this a good survivor game? Kind of. No, not really. I have a lot of problems with it. So you start off and it sort of plays how you'd expect. You pick your character and waves of enemies will start approaching you on a map. You target them automatically with your weapons, try to defeat them, level up with the XP they drop, and choose between an assortment of things to take. Another weapon to automatically hit the enemies with and upgrade for one of them. Pretty standard. But in this game there are things called passives and things called buffs. Buffs are pretty simple, normally just raw stats to your weapons, nothing fancy but still useful. Passives can be pretty interesting. Some of them act like weapons, like this one that leaves a trail of damaging circles behind you. Or they can add effects to other things, like turning the dash the characters have in this game into a flaming dash, which could also knock enemies away. The dash is one of the main things that the gameplay does differently to most other survivors on the market. It's not on a very long cooldown and gives you a nice dodge window to get through enemies. You'll definitely need it to give yourself some space because a lot of the time weapons aren't going to defeat every enemy next to you, so the dash becomes a very important part of your toolkit to last longer in the run. Another thing this game does is quite interesting. You see, there are 3 characters, right? Which is on a side point quite a letdown, to be honest. But what's cool about them is that they all have one signature weapon that they start with during a run. Red Guitar Guy has this short range slam thing, Singer Girl has this piercing projectile that honestly needs a damage buff, and the Purple Guitar Girl swings out in a huge arc in front of her. That one feels good. The interesting thing about these weapons though is that you can aim them. Just point the stick and the weapon will fire in that direction. I'm sure there's a few games that have done this already, but this is the first one I've played that lets you do this, and while I'm glad it's not a viral thing because aiming every weapon would kind of destroy the whole point of the genre, aiming one primary weapon here feels quite good, and as a side point, even necessary. As again, this game seems to be focused a lot more on positional tactics rather than walk around and wipe everything out in one hit, so having this main weapon to aim with is crucial to carving out a safe path to walk through. The last thing this game does different is the grid you've probably been wondering about at the bottom of the screen. It's kind of cool, it's basically your way of build crafting, but the game isn't really open enough to have much intentional choice going into a build. I'll get to that in a minute though. So every time you level up you get to choose what you want between 3 randomized options. If you choose a passive, it goes into this bar on the left, nothing else needed. But if you choose a weapon, you can then choose to place it on one of 12 slots on this grid. Then the game progressively activates anything you've placed in the 4 columns to the rhythm of this beat, cycling through it every 4 beats. The weapons will activate and strike out on their beats, you collect more, and so on. You can also place buff options you choose from leveling up on the grid, and these will show up with an area around them they will affect the weapons in. So you want to place your weapons at least a bit strategically to make sure the buffs can boost as many weapon stats as they can. Matching things up and positioning things in this grid is fun enough, but that is really where the things I thought were interesting in this game ends. I think that the system is fun on a management level, but I failure on a musical level, because this game just does not feel like the beat and the music are core aspects of the game at all. The enemies don't really move on the beat. I've seen slimes do it when they're out of range, but once they get close to you they just give up and chase you. The player does not move on the beat, being able to move fluidly. The bosses don't really attack on the beat, and since you're dashing around everywhere all the time, there is no recognition that you're playing to the rhythm. The only thing that plays to the rhythm are your weapons activating, and after the first 5 minutes of my first run, I forgot they were activating to a beat because nothing else was. So it just felt like they had a rigid cooldown instead of having any interesting timing mechanics. If they wanted to really showcase the looping system, I would have enjoyed it much more had the loop been longer or the game slightly overhauled to be made slower. To make the loop feels like it means anything, it cycles so fast that you don't even register the beat, and the game gets so chaotic as you focus on more difficult waves of enemies and dodging to put yourself in a different position that the system is hardly a thing that you take into account. It's just more of a hindrance because you can't increase your attack speed and go crazy like in so many other survivor games. This is definitely not a rhythm game like you might see other people call it. It lives up to nothing to do with rhythm except for the fact that the soundtrack does have some truly great songs. And speaking of the stats, I do think the actual upgrades you give yourself are fine. Upgrading a weapon will generally give the weapon more damage, a bigger area, more projectiles, that stuff is okay. You can upgrade the buffs and passives too, which just make their effects stronger. The weapons themselves are mostly good as well. I did find a lot of them unremarkable, but there are some interesting ones like the Allure weapon, which sends projectiles in an interesting pattern, weapon, and the Sun Eater weapon, which I ended up taking pretty much every run. This thing would send out a fireball that doesn't do much damage, but has a chance to spawn a consumable for health, which would really help me survive a lot longer. Each weapon or buff or passive belongs to what you can think of as a set. Every time you level up, you are greeted by, I'm not kidding, right? One of the 7 deadly sins. It sounds so crazy. I have some things to say there, but I'll save it for later. But yeah, basically every sin has their own set of items, their own weapons to choose from, their own buffs, and their own general build idea. Greed focuses on generating money and the various buffs you get from that. Pride has a lot of summonable minions as her weapons and the various ways you can buff those. Not interact with them, by the way, just buff them. I do actually like Pride's set of weapons though. She's a standout because summonable creatures aren't really a common weapon in these Survivor games. She's fun. But anyway, there's not a huge amount of build variety, and I think part of that has to do with the fact that there aren't that many weapons in the game. And the weapons that are there tend to have a lot more synergy with the buffs and passives from the same sin. You end up collecting a few things from maybe 2 or 3 different sins that sort of work together, which is a fine concept on its own. Like, I'm not bashing the items themselves really, but more so that you do kind of build the same thing quite a lot. There are some buffs which are staples and really good, so I always ended up grabbing those. And then there's not a massive selection of weapons to use, so each one wouldn't be exactly the same, but they began to feel very similar eventually. I think on their own the builds you're sort of tunneled into making don't have the absolute worst variety ever. Like, there is some difference from run to run, but that point feels like it becomes a lot more of a problem when you consider the fact that there's a lack of content everywhere else in the game. To start with, there's only one stage. One fairly basic dark blue place. It only ever looks like this, and every enemy wave is always the same. You fight wave after wave of the same enemies at the same time in the same place every run. And look, I can't knock it for just that. I mean, Brotato, probably the second most popular Survivor game ever, only has one stage in the base game. But what Brotato does have is a lot of depth and has an addictive stat loop where you buy 7,000 things every round, and also has a huge number of characters who will push you into playing the game a different way. There are no different ways to play in Devil Jam. It's just the same feeling loadout in exactly the same place every time. Brotato knows where the runs take place in every time is the same, because you're only playing for 20 minutes. But Devil Jam keeps you in each run for 3 waves of 10 minutes each, which are all separated by multiple minutes long boss fights. And I even found the bosses quite fun. Seriously, these are a good time. I think their designs are great, but there is a steep learning curve in this game when it comes to dealing damage fast. So, as you're learning, as I even still am, these bosses can take much longer to defeat than you would like. They become a slog that I imagine eventually do become quick to beat, since I did get the achievement for beating one of them in under a minute, but in most of my other attempts they took much longer than that to beat. This isn't an objective criticism on how fast you can beat them, since I'm sure after enough time you can beat them pretty quickly. I've tasted that. I'm saying that I didn't want to put the time in to do them quickly because of how I feel about the rest of the game, which does also apply here since there are only 3 different bosses that can appear in your runs, which have 2 boss encounters followed by the final boss at the end. You're just fighting the same guys every time, and with more boss variety and willingness to play this game a lot, I'm sure these would be quite a lovely addition to the game. But I just don't have the drive with the way the game is built and the way each run feels. These are the longest runs I've ever played in a Survivor game, which is the exact opposite I would hope for with the game's lack of content. It is slow trying to get through a run. I found myself losing interest a lot of times. There's not enough in this game to make the runs so long because it made me not want to do another and another like all these other games, because I knew if I started another run I would be there for a long time doing things I'd already done. So what happens in between those runs? Well, as for progression, I think there's some good stuff here. You're dropped into this home base where you can immediately access an achievement-like system called quests. This is how you unlock everything in the game, like the other characters, more sin characters to help your runs, and the ability to purchase extra sin choices. From there you can move into another room with a merchant in who can give you small stat upgrades, new interactables on the map which really quite vary wildly in usefulness, and those new options from the sins all for the price of gold. You collect gold from the achievements along with picking it up from breakables on your runs. At the start of the game this gold is used directly to purchase things from the merchant, but eventually it stops being used in favour of another currency, potions. These are currencies you also find out on your runs that drop from enemies every so often. There are 4 types, 3 being common drops and an extra premium one being dropped by bosses. On the other side of the room to the merchant you can exchange gold for whichever potions you want, so it's still important to be picking gold up. This is a functional system and does provide nice progression every time you come back, because you'll definitely be picking up a new achievement and a stat or 2 and maybe a new ability. I think there is a conversation to be had about how tiny each of these stat upgrades in the shop actually are, but the game doesn't really deal with massive numbers and I didn't mind getting them too much, although adding 1% crit chance to evasion for a good load of potions didn't feel amazing. This whole time I've been mentioning these 7 deadly sins and these characters, but who actually are they and what roles do they serve? No, that's not rhetorical, I'm genuinely confused. So when I loaded the game up, I chose to do the tutorial that was listed on the main menu. I do it, it works, and then I get dropped into that first room of the home base. I don't know who I am, why I'm there, why the devil is sitting right next to me, why he's giving me quests instead of talking to me. And then I make my way out to do a run, and lust, one of the 7 deadly sins, is giving me some help. I'm not trying to like circle around a little bit of story to nitpick and say there's not much. I genuinely did not get told anything, and I found that quite confusing. I don't know if doing the tutorial meant that I didn't get like an introductory cutscene. I don't know if it was a bug, but still to this moment, I'm not sure what's going on in this game because there's a lot to take in and nothing really is explained. And sure, why not throw in the devil and the 7 deadly sins and death into the game? That's fine, that's actually quite a fun idea, but they're just there for show. They get a couple lines each, but no more than that. No character, no story, no real reason for being there. I wanted a reason, a semblance of a world, something to tie it all together, but I don't seem to have gotten that. I'm so confused that I genuinely think something bugged out because of how much nothing I got. I did take a peek at some other people's thoughts, and evidently there is a sentiment about the game having lackluster characterization, which I don't have a problem with in a vacuum. Like, I play so many games whose characters are barely there, but they also pull their weight with the gameplay. And the problem is that when there are so many interesting figures who were all beautifully designed but so heavily inspired by the nicely played out characters in Hades, it really feels quite awkward that there's nothing behind those people when there could be so much more. Devil Jam was primed for early access with how much content there is in the game. I think it needed some more time before it came out as a full release, because so much of the stuff I just said wouldn't be underwhelming with the knowledge of this being in early access and the promise of more development to come. But it's not in early access, and while some of the areas of the gameplay are novel, there's a lack of substance and soul in this package as of right now, and while it can be fun for a short time, it's not one I would recommend for anyone looking for a survivor experience.